My uncle left me a shifty little bar in his will. One of the regulars never stops crying. You might remember some of the regulars of my bar, the new saloon. This is actually about the crying lady who always orders whiskey here, Shauna. For a long time, I didn't know anything else about her. Since I'm not retelling these stories in chronological order, I should probably mention that this happened before the incident with the little girl. It wasn't long after the whole Cole ordeal, though. What you need to know is that sometimes I have these little sudden spurts of excitement and curiosity. One day, I experienced exactly that, and the object of my interest was the sobbing lady in the corner. I stood around watching her for a while, unsure of whether to go over there or not. I wanted to talk to her, but I was worried it would upset her. I asked Andrick what he thought, and he said to just try, so that's what I did. I walked over to her, another glass of whiskey in hand. "Excuse me, Shauna? Hi." She looked up at me, her long, flowing gray hair framing a wrinkled, puffed face. "Hello? Are you Julia, right?" "I am," I replied, placing the glass in front of her. "On the house, can I sit with you?" Yeah, sure," she whispered, her voice shaky and stifled with tears. I smiled and sat down across from her. Up close, her eyes looked even sadder. I cleared my throat. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but why are you crying?" Shauna stared at me for a few seconds before lowering her head again, giving way to more heavy sobs. Her shoulders were shaking and there was spittle running from her slack lower lip. "Little Brendan. It started with Brendan. He was the first one. The first one I cried for. It was so long ago. So long ago. Over a century, maybe even 2. I winced. I hadn't expected her to start talking this freely, much less about something that happened 2 centuries ago. Part of me wondered if she was simply confused or a little crazy. But at that point, the experience a certain patron had had with his doppelganger was still fresh in my mind, so who was to say this was impossible? "I'm from a hill, from a mound," she went on, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I ascended from it. I need to warn them. I need to warn everybody, but I need to mourn them too. I've given up on the warnings. It happens everywhere, but I can't be everywhere, so they'll never hear my screams. So I have to cry for those that have been forgotten, the ones that disappeared or were replaced. The babies, the poor souls whose lives were stolen." "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. I wanted to understand. I wished to know more so desperately, yet none of what she said made any sense to me. "My dear lady," she uttered in a soft voice, looking up at me through hooded eyes. You don't look like Mac at all. You're so different from him. It's strange he chose for you to take over." In response, I frowned. "How so?" "Because," she looked like she'd forgotten what she'd been about to say. "I don't..." Her voice broke again and she lost herself in a fit of sobs. Suddenly she sat up straight. Her head jerked up and she looked me right in the eyes. I almost jumped at the unexpected movement. She spoke up again. Her voice was very stern and flat. "Little Brendan was out playing with his friends when they ventured into a forest nearby. They were not supposed to go there and they knew, but they were children. They were careless. What they were unaware of was the beast that stalked these woods, the beast their parents had not warned them about, believing themselves progressive in their rejection of this local superstition. They figured it was a forest full of wild animals, nothing else. Dangerous, yet to be expected. The children began a game of hide and seek, and all were found, except for one. No one ever saw little Brendan again. They found a torn piece of his clothing somewhere up in a tree. It was the only thing left of him." Shauna paused, tilting her head like she was wondering if I'd been listening. "When Brendan died, I wept for the first time. I sat by the creek where his mother and sister would go to fetch water, and there, I wept, waiting for them to come and see me. They knew he was dead before the other children returned with the news of his disappearance. I sat there staring at her, my head reeling. She was still staring at me, but her shoulders had slumped again. She slowly reached for her glass and brought it up to her lips, taking a small sip of whiskey before continuing. Every one of my sisters has a family to mourn or weep for. They follow them through the ages. They bring them news of a loved one's death or impending doom, even if the person in question is far, far away. I don't have a family like that. I'm here for the rest of them. My mind was spinning. Part of me was terrified, but the other part was simply overwhelmed. It was too much information to process. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder and looked up to see Andrick standing above me. "I'm sorry, Shauna, I need to borrow her for a second." With that, he helped me to my feet and led me through the bar's double door, out into the chilly, dark night. It really looked like you needed to take a break. And some explaining, maybe. "She's intense, huh?" "Yeah, you could say that," I muttered, reaching up to rub my temples. "So, you know more about her? Is she dangerous or anything?" Andrick smiled and shook his head. "Not in the least. She's not human, though. We really don't have a lot of those coming in, do we?" "We don't have a lot of them working here either," he replied with a shrug. "Shauna isn't like us, though. Actually, I pity her a little. Shauna is a banshee, or at least something of the sort. Legends and fairy tales aren't reliable. Someone always gets something wrong." He paused. "Do you know anything about banshees?" I sighed. "Of course not." "Well, banshees are a type of spirit. This means something to the tune of woman from the fairy mound, though they can hardly be called fairies. They're more like something in between, I'd say. Anyways, they're harbingers of death or extreme misfortune. Sometimes they'll even predict deaths. When you see a banshee, one that isn't Shauna, and she's crying or wailing, it means that either someone you're very close to has died or maybe about to." Wait, she said something like that. Something about how her kind has to follow a family or something. Some banshees have been said to be tied to one family in particular, that's true. Others appear randomly. Shauna, on the other hand, she has an entire group to tend to. Namely, everyone whose deaths are related to something unnatural, as in, she won't mourn someone who dies of old age, for example, but she has to cry for everyone who's gotten killed by, say, an evil spirit. He sighed, looking up at the sky almost dreamily. Imagine that. Chances are she'll never be able to stop crying. She can probably hardly keep up. So, she'll just be sad forever? That sucks. Can we do anything to help her? Andrick shook his head no. It's what she is. You can't stop her from being what she's supposed to be. You wouldn't be able to drag me away from this bar either. It's not exactly the same thing, but sort of. She won't stop. Ever. And that's why she sits around here all day. She's given up on running around trying to find the people she's crying for, so she just cries to herself, I guess. I think she's trying to live a normal life. I don't know where she lives or where she gets the money to pay for her drinks from, but I never talked to her long enough to find out. I hung my head. I felt sorry for her. She seemed rather nice, too. Suddenly, I had an idea. If she knew about the deaths she was mourning, then maybe she'd know about Cole. I rushed back inside and plopped down on the cushioned bench across from Shauna again. "Hey, I have this friend who I think might have had something really bad happen to him. There was this thing, this creature that could make itself look just like him, and it took his place. He said he wanted to go up against it. I haven't seen him ever since, and I know the monster is still living his life, so you want to know if he survived?" she said quietly. I nodded, and the woman let out a wheezing sob. I'm sorry for asking," I quickly added. "I didn't mean to bother you. I just thought I remember him. It's been a while, but I remember." Her voice was weak and faltering, as though she had to push herself, pressing each word out with laborious difficulty. "I screamed when I saw his doom impending, but then I stopped. I know he was in great danger, but I don't know for sure if he died." My chest suddenly felt lighter than ever. I suppose I had forgotten just how much Cole's disappearance had been weighing down on me. I wondered if he truly had survived, and if he would come back and tell me exactly what happened. But for the time being, I was satisfied knowing there was at least a chance he made it through. It was all I could ask for, and more than I'd expected. "Shauna, thank you so much for telling me. I hope I didn't bother you. I just had to know what happened to him." "It's all right," she breathed. To my surprise, she reached for my hand, giving me the faintest of smiles. I took and squeezed it. Her skin was wrinkly and her fingers stiff, but there was a comforting warmth to her touch. And then, all of a sudden, she opened her mouth and began to scream. Her voice, now shrill and loud, cut through the stale air and put an abrupt end to the tranquil chatter of the other patrons. The old woman's other hand jerked across the table, her bony fingers wrapping themselves around my wrist with the strength I would have never expected her to possess. She yanked me towards her by my arm, pulling me onto the table, still shrieking like a wild animal. I was in shock at first. I couldn't move at all. Then I managed to crane my neck and look up at her. Her wrinkled face contorted into an odd, twisted expression I couldn't read. Her eyes rolled into the back of her head and spittle dripping from her open mouth. It's coming for you. It'll eat you alive. It'll find its way in and tear you apart from the inside," she roared, her voice deep and throaty. I couldn't help myself. I began to scream, begging her to let me go. Her grip on my arm was relentless and sent tears of pain into my eyes. "She's gonna break my wrist," I thought. "It'll spread inside you. It's coming now." Shauna's cries drowned out even my own voice. The words left her lips fast. Some of her spit flew into my face, hitting my cheeks as I tried to helplessly recoil. "The spirit will blind you. He'll try to. He'll try." Her voice trailed off, and she began to gasp for air. Andrick had come up to us and kept pulling on her arm, trying to separate her from me. Finally, she let go of me and I sank down onto the table. All of this happened in a matter of seconds, but it felt like she held me in place for an eternity. My arm was burning in pain and I was panting like crazy. Danica came running up to me first. "Oh my God, are you okay?" the blonde girl asked, carefully picking me up by the shoulders and placing me back in my seat. I think something's broken," I whimpered. What in the world was that? Andrick was towering over Shauna, looking down at her in both anger and disbelief. She wasn't responding though. She just sat still, her lips quivering as though she was still weeping, but not a single sound left her lips. Eventually, she slowly pushed herself up from her seat. Andrick, looking puzzled, stood to the side to allow her to walk past him. I watched her leave, her crooked, frail figure disappearing behind the red double doors. "Are you just gonna let her go?" Danica asked Andrick, still looking aghast. "Yeah, let's go catch the ghost. That'll work out well," he replied, shaking his head. "This has never happened before. She's usually really passive. I don't know what's gotten into her." Glancing down at me, he added, "Does it hurt a lot? How bad is it?" "I literally cannot move my hand," I told him, biting my lip to keep myself from crying. Not only was there searing pain in my arm, I was also pretty shaken up. Shauna's words were still echoing in my mind. If she could predict people's deaths and warn them of it, what did that mean for me? I sincerely hope she just had a confused fit, as cruel as that sounds, but I didn't actually believe it, to be honest. I was terrified. "You should see a doctor," Andrick said. "Any idea on how to get to a hospital?" He was right. I wasn't going to drive using just one hand. I ended up going outside to make a few phone calls. I thankfully got a friend of mine who lived just up around the corner to pick me up and drive me. I don't remember the details, but my wrist wasn't broken. It still took me a little while for me to be able to move it again. Plus, my arm was severely bruised, especially where she dug her fingertips into my flesh. In the end, the worst thing about it was the shock, I suppose. Shauna wouldn't come back around for a long time afterwards. She stayed away from the new saloon for like 5 months straight, if memory serves me right. And when she did come back, it was like the whole thing never happened. We were wary of letting her back in at first, but when we eventually did, she just sat down again and cried. Shauna and I never really spoke at length again. I'll be honest, it felt really strange writing all of this out. Not just because it's been so long and I still feel sorry for the burden she has to carry, but also because I know now what she told me that day really had been a warning. And now, years later, I also know what she'd been warning me about. This thing that was coming for me. It. I can feel it inside me, even as I'm typing this.